Thank you for joining me in this conversation today. I'm going to talk about the disconnect in medical education, practice, and regulation. Almost doctor, but not quite. It's a problem that we're having in the society, it's a problem we're having as a country, and something has to be done. Why do I talk about it as a disconnect? I talked about it from a disconnect because in the last week I was watching a couple of series of conversations and YouTube interviews that were being done. There's one by the Health Diary that was by the Standard Media Group, and the conversation is about doctors, actually healthcare workers, clinical officers, that is, who have trained in clinical medicine, but the initial perception was they would be doctors upon graduation with their degree in clinical medicine. Where did the gap happen? Where was the lapse? Because they believed they would be doctors, but they were trained as clinical officers, and therefore they did not expect that. Maybe there's a communication gap somewhere. But beyond that, there's a conversation around how the industry has morphed over time and where do we have this disconnect? Because the reality of the situation is there is a disconnect. You're almost a doctor, not quite a doctor. You're almost in practice, but not really practicing. The regulations are also there, but they're not really there. So for me, when I look at the disconnect in medical practice, regulation, and in education, practice, and regulation is the fact that all these three components, from education to practice to regulation, have to be together. They have to be morphed. And being morphed means education equips you with a skill to be able to practice. But the practice also is regulated that you're able to deliver quality optimal care that gives you fulfillment in that journey. Where does the disconnect happen? The disconnect starts from education, which is the feeder system. But then also the feeder is linked to the regulation because the regulation of training education is also there. So the disconnect is we are as a society where education is not linked to people's aspirations to offer quality services or people's interest in a particular career. Partly yes, partly not. Partly not in the sense that you're coming from a society where pursuing a medical course is almost equated to guaranteed job, employment, and better prospects in life. Who doesn't want to have better prospects in life? I don't think there's anyone who would want to suffer. And therefore, in that case, then, most of young professionals, when they're finishing their high school or all levels education, they're looking for an opportunity to start into a medical course because there's that guarantee of a stable job and a well-paying job in that case. And that's where most of the training pursuits will be in the medical line. Unfortunately, the education sector has been watered down from lax in our regulations, but also the weak regulatory systems. Why do I say that? Regulation should establish that there is a need for doctors, there is a need for clinical officers, there's a need for nurses, there's a need for pharmacists, and therefore accredit training for these particular courses for which we have a local need or which there is a need in certain markets where we can now facilitate the transition from education into practice. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen, and education has become an entrepreneurial venture. And it is an entrepreneurial venture in the sense that David today would set up a university with the main aim of training healthcare professionals. Is it because there's a need for healthcare professionals? Or is it because there's a desire for that course from the market and therefore I can make money doing it? And that is why you'll have courses being rolled out that are training people in various different disciplines and faculties and cadres in the healthcare space. Unfortunately, you'll realize that majority of them might never have actual real practice settings or even a scope of practice that is defined. In that case, the university or the training institution or the technical college, that whatever it is delivering a training because the market believes that in doing a medical course you'll be guaranteed of a job, and therefore you want the job, you do the medical course that you want. It works, yes, but ultimately, these are the people who are suffering upon graduation when they have no place to practice and no future ahead of them, yet that is what drew them into the particular line of practice that they are in. Some of them ultimately end up in malpractices because you will hear people opening up services and practices which are not linked to what they need to do. That is a problem, and it is a problem that we need to address as a society. The other bit is around the parents now paying money for these courses, yet they are not even sure that their children will get jobs that they are hoping for, and that needs to be done. How do we intervene at this nexus? Regulation has to be clear that we are regulating practice based on the courses that we have in our ecosystem for which there's a clinical need for practice professionals. And therefore, there's no way we could allow and we should allow our regulatory agencies to regulate particular courses unless to regulate the training of a course unless they've defined scope of practice, so that it is clear that this particular cadre will practice A, B, C, and D to this extent, and this other cadre will do this to this extent. Without which, all accreditation should be reviewed and actually be reconsidered to ensure that we have a robust ecosystem where people practicing are actually trained for that, and the training is meeting the market needs. The other bit is in terms of practice. The disconnect happens from education to practice. You have your education and training in universities and the technical colleges where you're training, but then you have minimal or no interface with the market. Therefore, upon graduation from your university, you've never interfaced with the market. You don't know where you could practice and how you could practice. Ultimately, the transition becomes a challenge. When you miss that critical 1 year, 2 years immediately after graduation, before you get your first placement, introducing yourself and actually integrating into the ecosystem becomes a challenge. That is something that needs to be relooked. And that is why in some of the medical courses there is experiential learning, internship, attachment opportunities where you get to practice in a real life setting. Hopefully it gives you an opportunity to gain real hands-on practice and to grow in your career. Without that, we are missing a very critical bit of our education that needs to be invested in. The last bit around practice and regulation is people who are practicing are not informing education. People who are practicing are not informing regulations. Regulators are detached from practice and practitioners are detached from education and regulation. Ultimately, then it means whatever is being educated does not conform to the current trends and dynamics and needs of the market. Meaning we are training people in obsolete skills and technical knowledge that does not help translate to the impact that we need in the practice market. There's need for that nexus and that kind of synergy being created. On the other end, regulations are detached, and therefore, if we have a need in the clinical practice setting, if we never voice it and actually document it as a policy recommendation, it never gets itself into a regulation or a policy instrument. Ultimately, the regulation might either curtail our ability to practice and deliver service, or it might create more room, allowing for people who are not qualified to offer such services to get into that space. Ultimately, the person who loses is the patient, who is me and you. At the end of the day, when we go to a hospital, we're not able to get the care we need, we will all suffer. Is that what we wish for? I hope not. And if we don't expect for that, then we need to hold ourselves accountable, create the area of common nexus between education, practice, and regulation, but also be honest enough to acknowledge that training is responding to a need in the market where the public will feel like that is where I can get a job. So they are lying to you that there will be jobs, but they themselves, who are training you, do not even have a company, do not even have a hospital. So what are they? Where are you training you to go practice? So we need to have that conversation done, and we need to be structured and clear on what we hope for and what we would desire for ourselves as we go that journey. For those of you who enjoy these conversations and are feeling like there's much more of these that we need to have, please recommend those topics to me and we'll have conversations. If you want to be hosted in our studio, we'll be more than glad to host you and have a conversation and hear from you and learn from you as well in this journey. If you enjoy them, please subscribe to the channel, engage with us, share with your colleagues and your peers who will find value from this. Thank you and have a good one.